It may seem strange to state it, but audiences are really what cinema is for, especially horror cinema, which tends to be concerned less with high art and more with getting as many scares in as possible. So when you piss off the audience, you kind of spoil the whole deal. And what pisses off audiences more than anything? Yep, remakes. Whether denying audiences what they want, sullying and misinterpreting the source material, or ruining beloved characters, there seems to be an endless number of ways for remakes to upset horror fans. So I'm Gareth, you are watching What Culture Horror, and here are 10 horror movie remakes that pissed off audiences. Number 10, Ruin the Old, Failed at the New, Carrie, 2013. When you go about remaking an already half-decent horror movie, you need to have a good idea of how you're going to change things. Doubly so if you're remaking Brian De Palma's classic Stephen King adaptation, Carrie. And while director Kimberly Peirce had some sense of where she wanted to take the property, it wasn't nearly far enough for fans, and was often in totally the wrong direction. Like the original, the film situates its titular shy teenager, here played by Chloe Grace Moretz, in an average high school in Maine. Here she is picked on, bullied, and ridiculed. Only this time the internet is involved. I mean, fair enough. But the fans who thought they were really in for something new were sorely mistaken here. Peirce then spends the bulk of the film going in hard on Carrie's telekinetic powers, and the injury, blood, and gore that comes as a result of them, without doing nearly enough with her characters or updated setting. This comes to a head in the once iconic prom gymnasium scene, when rather than focusing on Carrie as a character, we are treated to a bombardment of digital effects-laden slow-mo deaths, each as grimly creative as the next, while Moretz cackles and waves her hands like an X-Man. It's all spectacle, no substance, and somehow manages to make the most important scene from the original film look like the party from 1999's abominable Carrie 2. Number 9, miscast an icon, Psycho 1998. Some admire Gus Van Sant's Psycho, his audacious shot-for-shot remake of Alfred Hitchcock's classic, and it has aged better than when it aired, coming to represent an experimental curiosity and a potent document of its time. But many fans can only be described as having been in a blind rage about it, and it's hard to argue with why. This version of Psycho follows the original beat for beat, but with a full color palette and a modern setting. But while the plot and much of the dialogue remains from the original, the cast, something else. Van Sant let his actors do their own thing, or at least didn't stop them, and who could blame them for wanting to leave their own mark on the production? Well, apparently everybody. The worst offender by a clear mile was Vince Vaughn, hilariously miscast in Anthony Perkins' role as mummy-whipped psycho killer Norman Bates. Vaughn of Swingers fame is uncomfortable in the part, lacking the nuance that makes Bates terrifying. His performance would have been funny if it didn't infuriate people as much as the sheer non-necessity of the film itself. So yeah, a lot of people were upset by the Psycho remake, but I want to know which horror remake angered you the most, and who else do you think has been miscast in a horror movie? Let me know in the comments right down below. Number 8 turned a hot property bland, The Uninvited, 2009. For audiences unable or unwilling to watch subtitles, the US English-language remake is a time-honored tradition. The formula is simple. An American company acquires the rights to a successful foreign-language film, often art house, horror, or even both, churns out a new version with all the nuances tweaked to the Hollywood standard, and makes a quick buck in the process. That's just how it's done. The Guard Brothers' The Uninvited is one such remake, scooping up Kim Ji-woon's psychological horror A Tale of Two Sisters, stuffing it with recognizable faces such as Emily Browning and Elizabeth Banks, and slicing it down to a tidy 90 minutes. Like its predecessor, The Uninvited brings a young woman, Browning's Anna, home after a considerable stay in a psychiatric facility, only to find her father engaged to an evil stepmother, Banks Rachel. Anna and her sister must do their best to investigate the circumstances surrounding their their mother's untimely death to satiate her ghostly spirit. Rather than languish in the same slow-burn subtleties of the Korean original and the one-two punch of its reveals around the death of its protagonist's sister, this version planes all the edges off and has Anna turn out to be a schizophrenic killer. The kind horror cinema has seen way more than its fair share of. Might be time for a new idea, just a thought. Fans of the original were aghast, and the uninitiated underwhelmed, leaving this one to fade into obscurity. Number 7, sanitized a cult favorite, Martyrs 2015. One of the crowning jewels of the new French extremity, Martyrs is a fan favorite the world over for those who like their horror with that extra grim edge. Yep, this one's for you. Pascal Laugier's film follows two girls who were abused and tortured as children, who attempt to take revenge and accidentally stumble into a whole new world of suffering with an underground cult who use torture to try and access the afterlife. Yeah, not an obvious pick for an American remake, and yet 7 years after the original, Kevin and Michael Goetz deemed it ripe for a more mainstream audience. In the process, however, the film was gutted. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the violence of the original Martyrs was one of the things that prevented it reaching a wider audience, subtitles notwithstanding, and so to wrangle it into a shape the massive US market could even begin to consider, the filmmakers had to sacrifice pretty much everything that made it interesting. Gone is the main character switcheroo, the moral ambiguity, and perhaps the grimmest, darkest ending in the horror canon. Instead, we have a much more clear-cut tale of good and evil, in which the heroines of the piece win, the police are called, and something like a happy ending arrives before the credits roll. And this thoroughly pissed off its audience, including Laugier himself, who couldn't stand more than 20 minutes of it. Number 6, Made Michael Man, Halloween 2007. Nobody could accuse Rob Zombie's movies of not being gory enough, as he has spent his film career trying to match his music, with ghouls and killers and as much disturbing imagery as he can get away with. So when his remake of John Carpenter's iconic slasher Halloween came along in the mid-noughties, everyone thought they were in for a bloody treat. The series had been flagging for a while and needed some new blood, and while the original was definitely still the best, a remake seemed like a decent idea if the franchise was ever going to get off the ground again. While Zombie wields the right aesthetic and knows how to craft a kill, he grossly overestimated the amount of backstory and exposition we needed on Michael Myers. Here, hulking wrestler Tyler Mane. The hallmark of The Shape has always been his mystery. His face is a secret that rarely sees the light, his troubles are deep and impenetrable, and his power is mysteriously supernatural. Zombie reduced the character to a mere man, giving us a close-up and personal jaunt through Myers' childhood, his first kill, his incarceration, and even his therapy. And fans absolutely despised it. Even those unimpressed by the string of schlocky, cheesy sequels over the years were angry and ashamed of what had been done to the slasher icon here, but the Weinsteins still bankrolled a sequel. If you're finding this list quite interesting, then good news, hit subscribe down below and you will get even more of these What Culture horror videos each and every day. Number 5, unintentionally hilarious, The Wicker Man 2006. Fewer films have provided more to the internet meme community than Neil LaBute's remake of British folk horror The Wicker Man. Less an attempt to remake a foreign film for US audiences, and more just an attempt to capitalize on a property almost as mythic as its own narrative. Because let's face it, even if you haven't seen The Wicker Man, you know what it is. LaBute's version stars Nicolas Cage in Edward Woodward's role, as a policeman who goes searching for a missing girl on a remote island and finds a pagan cult. The one thing this film should never have been is funny, and yet thanks to an untethered Cage and a series of questionable directorial and narrative decisions, the bees, the bear suit, you name it, it was precisely that. But audiences were not laughing, folks. This is the film that cemented Cage's cage rage image that would make him popular for all the wrong reasons across the following decade. And he haws and gurns his way through scenes, looking unnatural in even the most ordinary of circumstances. Riding a bicycle, say. There is no subtlety, no tension, and none of the original's atmosphere, and horror audiences decried it so badly it failed to make its budget back at the box office. Not good. Number 4 turned a badass couple into SoundCloud rappers, The Crow 2024. It was inadvisable for any director to go near The Crow, given how warmly regarded the Alex Proyas original is, and how poorly received all the sequels since have been. But last year, Rupert Sanders decided to give it his best shot. Rather than start a new chapter in the mythos, he returned to the source and recast Eric Draven with Bill Skarsgård, and his romantic opposite Shelley Webster with, well, FKA Twigs. Now, Skarsgård is generally considered a safe pair of hands, especially in horror, but that doesn't mean he can hoist an entire production on his shoulders, nor does he have any say in his character's aesthetic or background. Thus, the versions of Eric and Shelley we're treated to in this version of The Crow are less 9-inch nails and more Lil Pump. Gone are the leather and goth vibes, replaced with micro fringes, stick and poke tattoos, and tracksuits. The central couple are literally bedroom recording artists, living a floaty, dreamy Insta life that goes on far too long before being cut short by their murder. Audiences wanted something that would at least honor the original while carving its own name in the back, but what they got was a film that is not only mostly aesthetic, but the wrong aesthetic. And ultimately, nobody left the theater happy. Number 3 made Freddy a dull boy, and Nightmare on Elm Street 2010. Back in the late noughties and early 10s, tepid remakes and reboots of classic slasher movies were all the rage, with Texas Chainsaw, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and of course Nightmare all suffering under the weight of studios' desire to keep their IP burning. While most of the films from this time were deeply flawed, few did as much or as little for their main attraction as Samuel Bayer's A Nightmare on Elm Street. The film has a higher BBFC rating than the original, which allowed Bayer and company the freedom to really go to town on the chaotic horror side of things. But instead, they took one of the most animated characters from the horror canon and made him everyday and humdrum. And suffice to say, audiences did not react positively to that. Jackie Earle Haley does his best as Dream Demon Freddy Krueger, but the material just isn't there. No matter how much he snarled and menaced, there was no winning fans over on this one. Writers Wesley Strick and Eric Heiserer turned Krueger into a dark pedophile rather than an awesome otherworldly entity, robbing him of the humor Wes Craven and original Freddy Robert Englund had spent years injecting into the character. And the remake ruined Freddy's look to boot, removing the expressiveness of Englund's prosthetics and giving Haley a pinched, stiff, ratty mask reminiscent of the Buffy vampires. Number 2, the disassociating killer strikes again, Silent House 2011. One of the lesser-known properties on this list is Silent House, based on the Uruguayan film La Casa Muda, and remade by Chris Kentis and Laura Lau in 2011, just a year after the release of the original. The film stars Elizabeth Olsen as Sarah, a young woman helping her father and uncle do up the family's dilapidated Victorian countryside home ready to be sold. After a young woman appears at the door claiming to know Sarah, the trio are beaten, hunted, and terrorized by mysterious forces. Using a real-time footage effect that strings together the film's shots in a seemingly single continuous long take, we follow the action beat by beat until the big reveal. Sarah, who was abused by her family as a child, is also the villain. Audiences were enraged by this twist, not because it is unfaithful to the original movie, but because even before the film this was based on, this was a hackneyed idea. Identity, high tension, shrooms, you name them, the protagonist as dissociating killer bit has been done to death. Audiences know it well, and it's just not getting any fresher, people. Number 1, failed to start a franchise, Firestarter 2022. 2022's Firestarter, helmed by Keith Thomas, somehow couldn't improve on the original. Despite having all tools at its disposal, arriving on a wave of Stephen King hysteria, and working in comparison to a previously flawed version of the novel. In the film, telekinetically gifted Vicky and Andy use their powers to stop their progeny, Charlie, from A, burning their lives down with her uncontrolled fire powers, and B, being captured by a shady organization who want to experiment on her and put her skills to nefarious use. Now, for the first half, it actually chugs along nicely, with some neat action sequences and the kind of sudden, grim deaths we have come to expect of King's brand. But after the midpoint, the film slumps in a major way, and there's only one reason for it: sequels, baby. It's clear Thomas and Blumhouse intended to make this the beginning of a franchise of films set within what could be quite a rich universe, and the ending of the film suffered terribly as a result, just kind of flopping off and failing to stand as a film in its own right. Fans were rightfully angered at having spent 90 minutes plus trailers and however much of their hard-earned money on a film that serves as little more than setup for a sequel that, given the quality of this film and its poor return at the box office, will likely never happen now. Marvelous.